Hi, and welcome to Women in Products podcast. AI ethics is often presented as abstract or external to product work, but in reality, it is deeply human and fundamental to today's AI-infiltrated product development. We wanted to dive into the ways leaders might consider responsibility, judgment, and trade-offs in environments defined by speed, pressure, and ambiguity. Today, we're speaking with Angel Evan, an AI ethicist and practice lead at AG Consulting Partners, where he focuses on the ethical design, governance, and responsible implementation of artificial intelligence systems. Angel works with organizations large and small to help them navigate the complex intersection of AI innovation and ethical responsibility. Angel's focus is on guiding real-world decisions about how AI should be deployed to align with societal values and ethical norms. Welcome to the podcast, Angel.
Thanks for having me.
We're so glad to have you. This is a really broad, pretty deep topic. So we wanted to use our time with you to talk about some of the foundational principles behind this area. First, I wanted to ask you, so when people hear terms like AI ethics, AI safety, and AI responsibility, sometimes compliance as well, these often seem to be used interchangeably. But from your perspective inside organizations that you work with, what are the differences? What do these terms actually mean?
Good question, actually. I think you're probably right. I think they are used interchangeably, for better or for worse. I think there are probably subtle differences in them, too. I don't think responsibility is necessarily the same thing as ethics, but they're all pointed at the same thing. And I think at the end of the day, they're all pointed at this idea or this theme of kind of caring about the human condition. I think that's what they really kind of all have in common. If I kind of take my favorite version of it, which is ethics. Ethics is, technically it's the study of moral philosophy, and I think a lot of people probably know that. But a lot of the work of the ethicist, I think, is not just about thinking. I think it's fundamentally grounded in making decisions. You sort of weigh these scenarios, these contexts, the rightness or wrongness of a situation, and then you do your best to make decisions and perform a set of actions against that context. And so I think that's really kind of what it comes down to for me.
I don't know if you can explain this in an easy way, but how do these concepts become real for people who work in product and product management? Like, what actually is the translation of what you just said to work and the way maybe a spec is created, that kind of thing?
So, I think for a lot of companies, it usually starts with creating a set of what I would call principles. And so these principles we've seen everywhere. They've been around for years. And so these principles are the usual suspects like transparency, explainability. Those are really just kind of like guidelines. So they become real when you actually have to create things against them programmatically. So if we, for example, say that, we believe that fairness is a principle that we believe in, exactly what are we building that makes good on that? So, fairness has a few different versions to it. There's what we call group fairness, which is sort of, an easy way to think about that is, are men treated the same as women? That's group fairness. But we also have individual fairness. We can say all things being equal, are the outcomes that happen to Angel the same as the outcomes that happen to Shannon? And that's individual fairness. And then there are some who say, mathematically, you can't even arrive at fairness. It's a fool's errand. Why bother? That's not something you can prove mathematically. So you kind of have to wrestle all that to the ground. And then comes the hard part, like what are we actually creating that makes good on those values?
So can I ask what brought you personally into this line of work? What's your background?
So I had been in data science for a while. So since about 2014, roughly, I love the idea and the practice of being able to see trends and patterns that nobody else can see. And that's really kind of what data science is, I think, at its core. It's like being able to see these patterns that are so complex, they're not even detectable by the human eye. And I sort of love that because you could tell these stories that nobody else could tell because you could read data in a different way. And then along the way, after about 10 years, I sort of fell out of love with data science. Data science, I always have great amount of respect for it, but it turned much more into fixing broken data pipelines. It was less about sort of the exploration of finding, novel things that no one else could see. And around that same time, I started butting up against the most difficult questions of my career, which were actually ethical. So there are these situations that I was woefully, unprepared for, but I was fascinated with them at the same time, right? So they were both daunting and intriguing. And I did what most people do. I started down that road of self-education, learning what I could, reading what I could. And then I got to the point where I realized I could only go so far on my own. And at that point, I decided to go back to school, pursue it formally. And then I re-entered the workforce, as an ethicist, as a reformed data scientist, maybe.
What does the typical person that you encounter in these areas that you're working with a lot of different companies and a lot of different people with these roles, where do they typically come from?
I studied AI ethics at Edinburgh, and that is a truly unique experience. In my cohort alone, we had like 47 different countries represented in that cohort. And people come from all different kind of walks of life. Some people come from public policy. Some people come from law. Some people come from the technical side, like I did. So I don't know if there's a right pathway for ethics. I think what is probably more important is the ability to be able to work in an interdisciplinary way with all sorts of people from different walks of life. That's a really important skill for an ethicist to have.
Yeah, so people skills, cooperation, relationship building, very similar to product. I know you are actually working as a consultant in this area. So is that how you engage with companies? Maybe they're getting into AI implementations where they need to know more and they don't necessarily have that in-house expertise. Is that why they would bring someone like you in?
It's funny because, you hear AI ethics and you think, oh, wow, that sounds so specialized. It's actually not. Even within AI ethics, there's lots of pathways you can go down. I focus on governance and complex systems. And the reason I do that is because you hear that term and you sort of think, oh, God, that sounds so dry, And it sort of is, if you look at it on paper. But governance is really sort of the people and the protocols that you establish. But what happens there is that there's usually competing value systems. And so governance becomes sort of the way of normalizing all of that. We all want to do what's right, but we have competing ideas on what right actually means. So somebody's got to normalize that. And that, yes, that's usually why I end up engaging to help figure out how do you deal with competing value systems.
Right, because they are somewhat subjective, I suppose, and maybe cultural as well.
Yeah, that kind of brings us to the concept of morality, which we're all brought up with some kind of sense of morality based on where we come from and how we were brought up. And that's a little bit different for everybody. And I think what you grow up with certainly affects how you look at what is right or wrong. To your point, how do you sort of calibrate all those things becomes kind of one of the chief skills of the ethicist.
I see. So almost like being the nexus or the facilitator to bring people around to the same page so they can move forward.
I think so. When in the rooms or the meetings that I'm in, it's very common to have multiple attorneys. There's often a product manager in the room, obviously. We'll have technical program managers. We'll have straight program managers. We'll have engineers. We'll have engineering managers. And this goes back to my point about knowing how to work in an interdisciplinary setting, because all those people sort of come to the table with a sense of what they think they should do. And on some level, they're all right.
Yes, and you need a common starting point. So when that perspective is put down on paper, how does that work in terms of application? Like what happens there? What's the next step?
Yeah, this is exactly kind of why I sort of pride myself on being more the practitioner, less the theorist. Because, once we agree on sort of the ideal state, somebody actually has to translate that into a set of deliverables. And that's the role I play. And so that role is not necessarily germane to the ethicist. I think In a lot of ways, that's what a technical program manager will do, is sort of figure out what needs to be built or accomplished in a set of objective tasks, that everybody subscribes to. And that's the planning phase, planning what to build exactly. And PMs, they're used to that. They're used to creating OKRs. And that's that layer. That's kind of that second layer of planning.
Do you see or experience any tension or resistance in these teams? Because for the most part, everybody's trying to get something launched. Everybody's trying to get something out there that succeeds in terms of engagement, metrics, revenue, those kinds of things. And I could see maybe this competing sometimes with foundational principles that relate to morality and ethics. But I'm just wondering, does this come up and how do you deal with that?
It definitely comes up. When I was in school, a lot of the case studies we worked through were somewhat cut and dry in the sense that theoretically you sort of knew what to do. You could sense when a wrong was being committed, if a protected class was being disproportionately affected. It was sort of easier to identify. What I find is that in a lot of the companies I work with, a lot of what happens is this tension. It's this tension between wanting to reduce risk and actually moving forward with product. And so what I mean by that is you're never going to get to the point where there's zero risk involved in something. Risk is actually a function of change. Forget AI for a second. Risk just happens when change happens. And so that's part of what we're dealing with here. So I think a lot of what I had to learn to do is find the thresholds that allow products to be released and still maintain a level of safety. And that threshold is different for every single thing that you work on, for every single team that you work with. But I think finding that threshold is really kind of the key, because otherwise you're going to end up creating systems that are so heavy that the business ends up suffocating under the weight of them. They actually can't move forward. They actually can't ship product at the end of the day. And that's why I think that skill of finding those thresholds between, risk and productivity just becomes incredibly important.
Okay. Do you find that it's easy to get everybody on the same page with that context, knowing that it isn't going to be perfect? It's going to be your best shot at something, and then maybe everybody feels absolved of trying to reach this perfect state to start. Like, how easy or difficult is it to get everybody to rally around?
I think the comfortability probably changes depending on who you're talking to. One of the things I think you can do is, first of all, establish the fact that even though your objective is to create transparency in a product or the way data are collected or whatever, just know that whatever you do is not going to be fully representative of the concept of transparency. What you stand up is going to be a sliver of transparency. And so part of what you need to do is figure out, okay, how much of this principle do we need to capture in order to feel satisfied? And so when we say satisfied, that may, for some, be about how do we minimize the amount of risk that we take on. Risk has multiple forms. There is legal risk, there's financial risk, reputational risk, and sometimes all three are in play. So figure out the sliver of what you need to do. Do not try and create this massive, comprehensive thing that, like I said, becomes so heavy that it becomes unusable.
I'm curious about when there are disagreements. What kinds of disagreements are we talking about here?
Yeah, often I find that disagreement is not an ethical disagreement on how are we defining, fairness, for example. That's usually not where it pops up. I think where the disagreements usually happen is in defining the processes that we want people to go through. So, an example, I'll give you a real example. So, if we're saying, okay, we need everybody in this company to do responsible AI training. It's an easy box to check, so that might be sort of the goal. But how heavy is that training? When do they actually have to go through that training? And I think most importantly for me, I look at it and I say, how do we know if it worked? like, so these are kind of where I think the tensions or the disagreements come into play. I think everyone would agree in this example, yes, training's a good idea, but how we do it, how much of it we do it, do we test for it or not? How do we know if it's working? The details, that's usually where the disagreements occur.
Yeah, I imagine it's challenging for leaders. If the leaders, because this is new to everybody, what is sort of the most important thing for them to understand if they're trying to make sure they get off on the right foot and, have the right team in place? Like, what kinds of baseline literacy do they need to have?
A lot of times when we talk about AI literacy, we talk about sort of the mechanical skills that go into that. Prompting or knowing how to create agents or sub-agents or whatever that may be. But I think if we're looking at AI literacy more broadly, I think part of AI literacy has to involve ethical literacy. And so ethical literacy, to try and answer your question, I think it starts with empathy, trying to understand, okay, if I were to make this decision, how might it impact an end user? And when I say that, I think this is particularly important for product managers. When you go through that exercise of really exploring all the contours of an action and its outcomes, you've got to really explore the entire vector of possibilities, not just the ones that you want to happen or you think will happen, but what could happen. And then that kind of, you start going down the path of, what would I do if that happened? But it really sort of starts, I think, with an empathetic viewpoint and exploring all possible outcomes so that you can think through them appropriately. And that is something that kind of gets down to, that's not even ethics per se. That's almost just more like reasoning, which, by the way, I also think should be part of AI literacy, not just the mechanical skills, but critical thinking skills. So that's where maybe I would start the baseline, is thinking through an entire decision and its consequences.
I could see this being almost like a muscle that you had to use at some point, because we all had to do things in school. All of a sudden you're in a situation where you've got to bring that back. Is there any trick to getting that going again? Any way to grease those wheels?
Yeah, this is kind of what my entire thesis was. It was developing ethical reasoning skills. And I'll tell you, this is just my take on it. I think a lot of people sort of think that they're ingrained with, a sense of right and wrong or the right things to do. They think that making decisions is sort of like riding a bike. I vehemently disagree. I find that the more practice you get making decisions, especially in complex scenarios, the better you will get at decision making. And so one of the things that I advocate for, especially when I'm talking to big companies and their training programs, is I ask them, are you even creating scenarios or situations for people to make decisions? I think it takes repeated practice. I don't think it's just something you automatically know how to do.
Yeah, critical thinking and decision making, it doesn't necessarily come naturally to people, especially if they've been in jobs where they've been sort of taking orders for years and years and years, right? Yeah. Well, that's good news. I mean, that's the kind of work I think we all want to be doing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So what are you most optimistic about when it comes to what AI can do for us?
Most optimistic.
I'd like to hear what people think are the great things that are going to change in our lives for the better because of all of this focus.
Yeah. So I think a lot of times when people, hear that I'm, an AI ethicist, they almost sort of assume I'm pro AI. I'm actually not. I think my job actually is to stay objective as much as I can. But I do think, to get philosophical about it, I do think the best versions of AI, go back to this core philosophical idea of what does it mean to lead a good life? And I think the best versions of AI, whether advances in education or medicine, are that. They are instantiations of leading a better life. That's what happens when we get it right. What scares me to death is if we get it wrong. And what I worry about is that we've just created the next plastic, something that seems incredibly useful at the time, and then over the years we find out that it's poisonous and we can't get rid of it. And that's the part that I really sort of defend against.
And I haven't heard anybody compare it to plastic, but I think that's such an apt comparison. But yeah, I mean, we don't know what we don't know. We're only going to go forward, not backward. But, is there anything we can do collectively to sort of make sure that we're engaging on this topic and helping where we can if we're not in decision making roles? Like, where can everybody get educated and make sure they're making their voices heard?
I think there's probably a couple dimensions to that. I think making their voices heard in our democracy. I think AI in all of its facets, the good ones and the bad ones, are probably going to show up in the midterms later this year. And especially when we talk about job displacement and this division of wealth that it's obviously creating. So I think you can make your voice heard there. I think you can also make your voice heard in the workplace as well. But I think what's a better approach is to understand what's available to them, first of all. And one of the things I see is that, and this happens more in kind of small to mid-sized companies that are maybe under-resourced, is that there maybe aren't the funds to do that kind of education. And so part of what you may need to do to get your voice heard or even to learn more is self-educate, which I think is absolutely legitimate. And then as a PM, if you find yourself in this sort of ambiguous situation where maybe you don't have these processes and protocols in place, the guardrails in place to really help you, I think the advice I would give there is, you don't necessarily want to become that person, whose job it is, but I think you want to make space for it. So, it's okay to start small and iterate. I would actually advocate for that as opposed to creating one monolithic solution that takes years to get out the door. It's okay to start small and leave space for improvement. Much like machine learning is an iterative process, it gets better when it sees new instances, when it experiences new things. Ethics is the same way. You get better when you see new events and you learn how to deal with them. So, a few years ago, for example, I think we were all pretty convinced that, okay, we have these things called machine learning models, and this is how they work, and they seem pretty straightforward. And then, we got agentic AI. And then within agentic AI, we have sub-agents, and then we have skills. And, so wrapping your head all around that is kind of daunting, I think, for sure, which is why it's good as a starting point to, like I said, understand the technology, so you understand what you're really dealing with. You can do that in a self-educating way. And then understand what resources are available within the company to sort of put those guardrails around things and then grow into it. You don't have to have it all done or figured out on day one. I don't think anybody does, to be honest. So those are maybe some of the tips that I would give for people that are maybe at a loss for figuring out what to do or how their voice can be heard.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned AI literacy earlier, and I believe that term is becoming kind of mainstream now because the government has put out their own guidelines for what AI literacy even means just this week. So what does it mean to you? What is AI literacy? What does that term suggest?
So to me, AI literacy is, I think it's an understanding of the multiple dimensions. They're almost like courses of study academically. They're more broad than they are narrow. And so, some of the topics that I see that I think should be involved in AI literacy, a real AI literacy program. We talked about mechanical skills, for example, and that's where most people start. I actually think those will become the most commoditized. So if I'm really good at prompting and you're really good at prompting, how do we compare? How do we evaluate an employee if all of our skills are just average? So I think mechanical skills are seemingly important right now, but I don't know how durable they are. But that's one of them. I do think architectural understanding, when we talk about large language models, just having an understanding of, okay, there's like these three major components of an LLM. There's the encoding, there's the attention head, and then there's the probabilities. And the probabilities are where all the problems typically lie in terms of hallucinations and whatnot. So just having an understanding of how this stuff works. But then I think you get into some of the other things. I think you get into things like ethical literacy, critical thinking, And for PMs, I think there should be an entrepreneurial aspect to that too. How can I use this in my company to really make a difference? And for PMs, that comes in two flavors, I think. That comes in, what tools am I using from a productivity standpoint to do my job better, more efficiently, faster, whatever the metric is. And then there's the, how do I create AI features within the realm of a product? I think having an entrepreneurial dimension to AI literacy is important too.
And I know that you're passionate about this, and I hope to see more from you about this area, because I had a hard time finding information for myself. I'm trying to self-educate as well. Is there any go-to that you can suggest for people who want to start learning right away? Are there any books or organizations where we can go and start just reading?
I think there probably are some good resources out there. One of my go-to resources is the Stanford HAI Index, HAI. That is the most comprehensive index on AI I know of. It comes out once a year, but it covers lots of topics like this and many more. So that would be one place that I would look at. I think the one thing I would be wary of is a lot of times what happens is when these new themes sort of evolve, like AI literacy, everybody kind of has a version of them, and I'm not sure really how useful they are. They're largely theoretical. I would be wary of the many flavors of them or people's interpretation of them. I think it's much better when you can see real examples of AI literacy within a company rather than just someone wildly espouse on what they should be, which is purely conjecture.
No, that's very good advice. We will link to the Stanford HAI Index. Now that you mention it, I have seen those reports.
And it's funny because I worked at Stanford for a couple of years and I helped HAI create a course specifically for that index. And when you're creating a course, you have to sort of figure out, who is this for?
I also know that you have a podcast of your own. And I think some of the topics that you cover really make you think. Like, a lot of them have to do with philosophy and contemporary writers who we don't necessarily have an excuse to think about, but we'd love to link to that as well in the description, and so people can check that out and see where some of these foundational principles actually come from.
Yeah, I do think at the end of the day, ethics and responsible AI cannot be a theory. I don't think we need more thought leaders in this space, to be honest. I think what we need are practitioners.
Thank you so much. This has been really thought-provoking, as it was meant to be. I personally learned a lot, but I think our listeners will as well.
Absolutely.
This podcast is an original production of Women in Product. Follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or the Women in Product YouTube channel. Leave us a review so that others can discover us, or share this episode with someone you know. Original music provided by Jimmy Hahn. Thanks for joining us.